Hi, so this is going to be a review of immunizations. And when we think about immunizations, we need to remember that immunizations have been around for a long time. The first vaccine has been around for over 200 years, and since that time we've saved millions of lives, all associated with immunizing our children and even our adults. So since that time, we've only been able to eradicate one disease, and that's smallpox. But a lot of diseases have been eradicated in some parts of the world, but not in others. So polio is one of them. So polio is a disorder that no longer occurs in the United States, but we still see this in small world countries. Some other diseases that have been nearly eradicated and are starting to show their ugly faces again are diseases like the measles. So measles were all but gone in the United States, but really started to show their ugly head again in the early 2010s, and since that time we've had multiple outbreaks. Some other disorders that we're starting to see are things that we're not even sure how to immunize against, and one of those is a disease called acute flaccid myelitis, and it's a disorder that's very similar to polio, where it causes severe muscle weakness, it causes weak reflexes, difficulty breathing and swallowing. Fortunately, it's not caused by the same virus as polio, but at this point we still don't have a immunization for it. So in the United States, our state policies mandate that people are immunized against certain diseases, and since 1990, all 50 states require that school children have certain immunizations prior to going to school. And as you can imagine, this has caused a lot of ethical concerns. Some people say it's against their religious beliefs. Some people just don't philosophically believe in giving immunizations. And some people say it just takes away their own autonomy in their own decisions, their own ability to make their own decisions. But all 50 states do allow for vaccine exemptions for different medical conditions. And also some states will allow for religious exemptions, and then other states will also allow for exemptions for philosophical reasons. So it's important that you know what's going on in your own state and what the rules are for children in your state. So in Delaware, children can go to school without immunizations. However, they do have to have a signed release form saying that they are exempt for religious purposes. But that poses a real risk to other children in the school if that child is not immunized and comes into the school with a contagious disorder. So those kids actually will be banned from coming to school if they've been exposed to anything, which obviously is going to infringe upon their academic progress. So there's a lot of things to think about. So this is what life looked like before vaccines. So I'm not sure that you guys are familiar with what you're looking at here, but this is actually called an iron lung, and the iron lung machine was used back in the late 40s and the early 1950s for people who were crippled with polio. And it provided a way to provide lung support for these patients prior to vaccines coming around, and to be able to keep these patients alive. So polio is one of the disorders, like I said, that we developed a vaccine for it in the early 1950s, and since that time it's pretty much disappeared. Of course, the iron lung went along with it. However, I will say that I started practicing nursing in the 1980s, and at that time we were still using iron lungs for some patients in the intensive care unit with different disorders, specifically disorders like muscular dystrophy. So these machines certainly had their purpose. So, like I said, there's been a lot of diseases that have been eradicated in the United States. 13 of them in particular. So if you take a look at this slide on the left-hand side of the screen, prior to us having vaccines, you can see the morbidity rates in the United States of different disorders caused by diseases such as diphtheria and influenza and measles. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the most recent reports of cases in the United States since we've started immunizing. So we know that vaccines work. We know that we've saved millions of lives with them, but there's still a lot of ethical issues and concerns that go along with it, and still a lot of people who still don't believe in vaccines and refuse to vaccinate their children. So this is just an easier slide to read from the last one, but this is actually a morbidity and a mortality slide. So if you think of morbidity, morbidity is the number of people that actually get sick from a disease but don't actually die from it, whereas the mortality is the actual number that have passed away. So I think this shows some pretty significant numbers on the left-hand side of the screen of people who got sick from these diseases prior to vaccines, and then those after the number after the vaccines came out. So it's pretty significant. Measles is another condition that I had brought up earlier. It was nearly eradicated. However, around 2011, we were starting to see cases of measles coming in from other countries. You can see how low the numbers were in the early 2010s, but the far right-hand side of this slide shows our numbers in 2019. And these large numbers of cases were mostly from areas like New York City, where we had large constituents of groups who were non-vaccinators, and that's where we would see these diseases being spread. So measles is more likely to spread and cause outbreaks in communities where groups of people are not vaccinated. So we really can't talk about communicable diseases without talking about coronavirus. So as of now, coronavirus is still very present in the United States. As all of you, I'm sure, are aware, this is a virus that was brought to the United States back in early 2010. I think we started seeing our first cases in February from Wuhan, China. And it is considered a acute respiratory illness that causes symptoms from fevers to cough to shortness of breath to fatigue to muscle aches, headaches, loss of taste and smell, sore throat. Can also cause a lot of GI issues like nausea and vomiting and diarrhea. And the symptoms can range from mild to severe. But we've had over 5 million cases in the United States since February. So what is that in the last 6 months? With close to 200,000 deaths already. So the numbers are significant. Nationally, we have completed over 78 million tests as of yesterday, and we have about a 9% overall positive rate in those that have been testing. But remember, some of these clients or patients will have minimal symptoms, and some may have very significant symptoms. So these are our state of Delaware COVID numbers. So far we've had close to 17,000 cases with over 600 deaths. Currently we have about 40 patients in the hospital in Delaware, and about 12 of those are critically ill. It's important to know that this has a high recovery rate, so we have reported over 9,000 recoveries already. Sussex County was hit particularly hard this year from COVID. A lot of that had to do with our vulnerable population in Sussex County, particularly in the migrant workers and in the poultry factories, but also in our young people coming to our resort towns and going out to bars and stuff. So Sussex County was hit particularly hard. But as you can see, when we think about pediatrics, so our number of cases of pediatric transmission have been really, really low. We're only reporting about 1.7% of cases in very young children and about 6% in older children. But our death rate in this population is extremely low, so it's less than 0.1% in younger children as well as in older children. So kids, fortunately, this is one illness where they tend to do better than adults. They don't tend to carry the illness as much, and they don't tend to be able to transmit the illness as much, which is some of the things that we have to think about when we consider sending our kids back to school. So one of the new initiatives that's out is something called the COVAX initiative, and this is a World Health initiative that encourages countries to work together to come up with a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19. And the hope is that we can come up with a safe vaccine in months rather than the typical many years that it takes to develop a vaccine for a communicable disease. Currently, there's 9 potential vaccines being looked at, and several of them are from the United States, and several of them are also in phase 3 of trials. So they're moving along pretty quickly. And the goal of COVAX is to, again, get these groups to work together rather than working in silos to come up with an effective vaccine quickly. And their hope is to deliver 2 billion doses of the vaccine by 2021, and to be able to equally distribute that around the world. But specifically, we want to focus on prioritizing our most vulnerable, and that would certainly start with our healthcare workers, and then expand that to our other vulnerable groups, such as the elderly and those that have pre-existing conditions. So this is something to certainly keep a lookout for, and something that I think we're going to see sooner rather than later. So when we think about immunity, we have to think about the different types of immunity. So you can have active immunity. So active immunity happens when you're actually exposed to a disease, and the body is going to trigger some kind of an immune response. That exposure can happen in several different ways. You can have natural exposure. So you're actually, this occurs when a person is actually exposed to the disease itself, and through that they develop a natural immunity against that disease or virus. But it can also occur through vaccinations. So there's a couple of different vaccinations that we can get. We can get live attenuated vaccines, which means we're actually given the live virus, but just in a weakened form. Or we can get an inactivated form of the vaccine, which would be a killed virus. But both of these types of exposure are going to still allow the body to create an immune response. So the nice thing about active immunity is that it's long-lasting, and sometimes it's lasting throughout lifetime, so that you don't even need boosters for this type of immunity. And then we can get passive immunity, which means that a person is actually given antibodies to a disease or a virus rather than producing them on their own. So one way we can do this is through the placenta, right? So a newborn baby can acquire passive immunity from its mother. But people can also get passive immunity by getting antibody-containing blood products, such as immunoglobulins or IVIG. And these can be given when we need immediate protection from a specific disease. So you may have heard about recently in the news, they've talked about people who have had COVID are donating their blood to positive COVID patients who are in intensive care to help them fight off the disorder. This is a form of passive immunity. So we're actually taking somebody's blood that already has antibodies in it, and we're giving it to someone else. The problem with passive immunity is that it's typically short-acting, specifically in children who get those antibodies from their parents or from their mother. Those antibodies don't last very long, so the child will still, or the person will still need to develop active immunity in some way. And then we also have something called herd immunity. And with herd immunity, this either happens because most of the population has either been exposed to the illness or most of the population has been vaccinated, but it provides a significant proportion of a population immunities to a certain disorder, which makes the spread of that disorder less likely. So I'm going to stop here and start recording on the next slides.